Most people picture King David's palace as a place of glory, psalms, and military triumph. The truth is something else entirely. What happened inside those walls on a single afternoon destroyed a family, fractured a dynasty, and fulfilled a brutal prophecy. This is the story of Amnon, Tamar, and the silence that cost everything. Consider the palace in Jerusalem around the year 980 BC. David had been reigning for nearly 2 decades. The Canaanites had been pushed beyond the borders. The Ark of the Covenant rested in Jerusalem. The Philistines were no longer a credible threat. The warrior psalmist had consolidated an empire stretching from the Euphrates River to the gates of Egypt. From the outside, this was the apex of the Israelite monarchy. From the inside, the king's house had already begun to collapse in silence. David had at least 8 recorded wives and an unspecified number of concubines. The sons numbered 19, confirmed names in the biblical records, not counting the daughters. Their mothers came from different cities, different tribes, and different kingdoms. Each child was raised in separate quarters with their own servants and their own tutors. They were half-siblings who barely knew one another. They were rivals before they were family. And there was one man in that house who watched all of it. That man's name was Jonadab. We will come back to him. The cost of this arrangement would surface later in the form of corpses, exiles, and a civil war that would send David himself fleeing Jerusalem barefoot. We will come back to that as well. Amnon was the firstborn, son of Ahinoam the Jezreelite, the first wife David took while still fleeing King Saul before being crowned in Hebron. By the natural order of Semitic succession, he would be the next king of Israel. The throne was his by birthright. He was between 22 and 25 years old when the tragedy occurred, according to the chronology most widely accepted by historians such as Eugene Merrill and William Albright. Tamar was the daughter of Maacah, princess of Geshur, an Aramean kingdom north of the Sea of Galilee. Maacah was a wife of royal origin, not a concubine. That made Tamar a princess by 2 lineages, daughter of the king of Israel and granddaughter of the king of Geshur. The records describe Tamar as exceptionally beautiful. The Hebrew text uses the word Yafa, the same word applied to Sarah, to Rachel, and to Abigail. It was a beauty the tradition recorded as remarkable even by the standards of the royal court. Tamar and Absalom were full siblings, children of the same mother. Amnon was their half-brother, born of another wife. That familial distance within a palace of separate quarters and independent households created enough space for Amnon to see Tamar not as a sister, but as an available woman. And that is exactly what happened. Consider the situation described in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 1 and 2. The text softens nothing. Amnon became so obsessed with Tamar that he made himself ill. He grew visibly thin. He wandered through his own quarters in anguish day after day. The servants began to notice. The king himself observed the deteriorating state of his eldest son and could not understand the cause. But what Amnon felt was not love. Biblical Hebrew has distinct words for affection, passion, and desire. The term used to describe Amnon's feeling is aheb, which can include carnal desire without genuine attachment. The narrative context makes it explicit. Amnon wanted to possess Tamar physically. He was not seeking marriage. He was not pursuing a conjugal union. He wanted her body, and he was blocked by what appeared to be an insurmountable barrier. Mosaic law in Leviticus chapter 18 verse 9 explicitly prohibited relations between siblings, even half-siblings by a different father or a different mother. The prescribed penalty was exclusion from the community. Tamar was a virgin princess living under the direct protection of the palace in guarded quarters. Access to her was restricted. Marriage within the royal lineage required the king's direct approval. Everything conspired against what Amnon wanted. And then Jonadab appeared. The text of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 3, describes Jonadab with a single uncomfortable word. In Hebrew, Ish Chakam Meod, traditionally translated as a very cunning man. The word Chakam is normally used for divine and moral wisdom. Here it carries a negative weight. Jonadab was shrewd, calculating, son of Shimea, David's brother, first cousin to Amnon. He lived in the palace. He knew the corridors, he knew the routines, he knew the weaknesses of every prince in the royal household, and he offered Amnon not merely advice, but a complete operational plan. Consider what that plan required. It was necessary to draw Tamar into a space where she would be physically alone with Amnon. No handmaidens, no guards, no witnesses. It had to happen inside the palace to avoid suspicion. It needed a direct order from the king so that no one would question her movements. And it needed a pretext so innocuous that David himself would authorize it without hesitation. Jonadab found all of this in a single performance. The instruction was precise. Amnon was to lie down in bed and feign illness. When the king came to visit, he was to make one specific request, that Tamar come to his house and prepare 2 cakes before his eyes. The Hebrew word for those cakes, leviva, appears only in this passage in the entire Bible. It was a heart-shaped bread, believed to be restorative for the sick. Requesting food prepared by a loved one for an invalid was an accepted custom, and requiring it to be made in the visual presence of the patient was a detail that reinforced the credibility of the request. Everything fell within the cultural logic of the time. David fell for it. The king visited his son, and hearing the request, immediately sent for Tamar. She obeyed without question. It was an order from her father and her king. She took flour, kneaded the dough, went to Amnon's quarters, and began preparing the cakes before him. Everything was public. Everything appeared safe. Everything followed the protocols of the royal household. The text then records a detail that shifts the rhythm of the narrative. Amnon refused to eat. He ordered all the servants out. He said, "Clear everyone out of here." And when the last attendant closed the door behind him, Amnon turned to Tamar and told her to bring the food to the inner chamber so that he could eat from her hand. The trap closed. Consider what Tamar faced in that instant. A virgin princess, 19 or 20 years old by the most widely accepted calculations, alone in an inner room with the heir to the throne. No handmaidens, no guards, no witnesses, a door between her and any help. And Amnon, physically stronger, 2 or 3 years older, holding her by the arm. The text of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 12 and 13, records with precision what Tamar attempted. She spoke, she argued, she negotiated. She said, "This is not done in Israel." She said he would lose his honor forever, that she would become one of the disgraced women of Israel. She suggested he ask the king, because David would not refuse. That was a legal door left open. Marriage between half-siblings had precedent in some noble traditions of the ancient Near East and could be authorized by the king as a dynastic exception. Amnon would not listen. The text is unambiguous. He overpowered her. He was stronger than she was. He raped her inside her own father's palace. And then comes the most disturbing line in the entire biblical account, 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15. Immediately after the crime, Amnon hated Tamar, and the text specifies the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the desire with which he had desired her. In a single sentence, the scripture strips bare the nature of what he felt. It was not love, it was possession. Once obtained, it curdled into revulsion. Once obtained, it became violent rejection. Amnon told Tamar to leave. "Get up and go." She tried once more to reason with him. She tried to explain that sending her away after what he had done was worse than the crime itself. In a culture of honor, a violated virgin princess might still have some protection if she remained in some formal bond with her attacker. Cast out without marriage, without restitution, she would be marked forever, unmarried forever, socially barren, alive but as good as dead. He did not listen. He called the servant at the door and had her thrown out. He bolted the door behind her. Step outside the palace for a moment and note the detail the text preserves. Tamar was wearing a distinctive garment, in Hebrew, Kethaneth Pasim, the same word used to describe the coat given to Joseph by Jacob. It was a ceremonial robe worn exclusively by the virgin daughters of the king. It was a symbol of status, of purity, of dynastic honor. It had long sleeves reaching to the wrists, woven from threads of varying colors, recognizable at a distance in the streets of Jerusalem. Tamar tore that robe there, still standing at the door of Amnon's quarters. She put ashes on her head. She placed her hand on her head in a gesture of mourning, and she walked out into the street crying aloud. It was anticipatory grief for her own life, ending in that moment. It was funeral rites performed for herself, in broad daylight, in full view of everyone, and all the servants of the palace saw it. Absalom saw her first. The full brother, son of the same mother, understood instantly what had happened. He asked only, "Was it Amnon, your brother, who did this to you?" Tamar did not need to answer in words. Absalom took her to his house and kept her there. "Be quiet, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this to heart." The text then records a sentence that carries its own weight. Tamar lived as a desolate woman in the house of her brother Absalom. Desolate. The Hebrew word is shomamah. It means barren, devastated, abandoned. She did not return to the quarters of the princesses. She did not marry. She had no recorded children of her own. Years later, Absalom would name his daughter Tamar, a tribute that was also an open wound worn through the corridors of the capital. Tamar's public life ended that afternoon, and David knew. The text of 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21, records the king's reaction in two Hebrew words. He was very angry. Some versions of the Septuagint, the oldest Greek translation, add a line that the Masoretic Hebrew text omits. It states that David did not punish Amnon because he loved him, being his firstborn. It was the blindness of a father's heart. It was the failure of a man who had long since stopped disciplining his eldest son. It was also the response of a man who knew that he himself had committed adultery with Bathsheba, had indirectly arranged the murder of Uriah, and had heard from the prophet Nathan a specific sentence. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 10. The sword would never depart from his house. The prophet had been literal. The sword would begin inside the house. David could not bring himself to punish his son because he already knew himself condemned by his own acts. And Tamar paid part of that debt. Follow now the silence that followed. 2 full years, 24 months, 730 days, during which Absalom said nothing to Amnon, neither good nor bad. The text specifies this. The silence was strategy. Absalom was waiting for the right moment. Consider the weight of those 2 years. The palace continued to function as normal. Official gatherings with all the royal princes present, court banquets, mandatory religious festivals. Amnon ate at the same table, sat in the same audience hall, received the same treatment due a firstborn. And Absalom smiled from across the room and waited. The justice that the father refused to deliver was quietly being prepared inside the house, in silence, over 2 years. And all the while, Tamar remained in her brother's house, desolate, with no public voice, no restitution, no matrimonial future. The entire palace knew what had happened, and the entire palace continued as if nothing had. Workers came and went, servants cleaned the corridors. Diplomatic meetings were conducted in the central hall, and in the rooms of the second pavilion, a woman in her 20s counted the days with no future ahead of her. Silence. In the second year, Absalom organized a sheep shearing at Baal Hazor, near Ephraim, approximately 25 kilometers north of Jerusalem. Sheep shearing was a festival of abundance and celebration in ancient Israel. It marked the end of the annual pastoral cycle. Absalom had large flocks as a prince. He invited all the king's sons. He personally invited his father, knowing David would refuse. The king was traveling less and less. When David declined, Absalom made an additional request. He asked that at least Amnon go on the king's behalf. David was suspicious. He asked why him specifically, but he relented. He sent all his sons together to the event. The trap had the same architecture as the one Jonadab had built 2 years earlier. Ask the father. Use the king's name. Ensure the victim came without suspicion. The architects were different, but the method was a mirror image. The house of David had begun to cannibalize itself, using the rules of royal hospitality as weapons. At Baal Hazor, at the height of the feast, with Amnon's heart merry with wine, a phrase the biblical text records with deliberate bluntness, Absalom gave the signal to his own servants. When Amnon's heart is merry with wine, and when I tell you to strike Amnon, then kill him. Do not be afraid. The order was explicit. The legal responsibility rested with the prince who gave the command. The servants would not be subject to blood vengeance, because the instruction came from above them in the hierarchy. The servants struck. Amnon died there at his brother's table. In the middle of the feast he believed was a gesture of family reconciliation. Panic. The king's sons rose in disorder, mounted their mules, and fled in every direction. The rumor reached Jerusalem distorted by terror. They told David that Absalom had killed all the king's sons. Not one had survived. David tore his garments, fell to the ground, and all his servants tore their garments as well. Jonadab appeared again, the same man who 2 years earlier had engineered the crime against Tamar, now played the opposite role. He told David not to believe the report, that only Amnon was dead, that this had been determined by Absalom from the day Tamar was violated. Jonadab had known everything. He had always known. He had been the silent architect from the beginning, and now he was the interpreter of the catastrophe. Return to that man. Jonadab was never punished. He remained a royal counselor. He remained in the palace. The true engineer of the royal family's collapse died in anonymity in the biblical records of old age. Absalom fled. He went to Geshur, the land of his maternal grandfather, taking refuge with King Talmai. He remained there 3 complete years, 36 months in exile. David wept for Amnon every day in the beginning. Then the text records that the king's soul longed for Absalom because he had been comforted regarding Amnon. It was the divided mind of a king, the dead son and the murdering son. He could not fully condemn either of them, and he ended up losing both. Joab, the commander of the army, intervened. He arranged through a wise woman of Tekoa a parable that persuaded David to permit Absalom's return. But David refused to receive his son in audience. Absalom spent 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing his father face to face. Another 24 months of silence between father and son. And in that silence, Absalom began plotting something far larger. Calculate the magnitude of what followed. Absalom began positioning himself publicly at the city gates. Every morning before dawn, he waited for those who came to seek justice from the king. He spoke with each one, listened, suggested that if he had authority, he would handle their cases better. He kissed every man who tried to bow before him. In 4 years, according to the text, he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. When the conspiracy was ready, he went to Hebron, the ancient capital where David had first begun his reign. There he proclaimed himself king. He gathered supporters, 20,000 men at some point during the movement, according to estimates drawn from the 2nd book of Samuel, chapter 15. David fled Jerusalem, barefoot, with his head covered, weeping as he climbed the Mount of Olives. He crossed the Jordan. He commanded his forces from a distance. It was the greatest humiliation of the warrior king's political career. The civil war culminated in the forest of Ephraim. Absalom became caught by his long hair in a terebinth tree during his flight after being defeated in battle. Joab found him and drove 3 darts through his chest, and 10 young men finished him off. 20,000 men died in Israel that day. 20,000 citizens. In a single forest, in the height of a Palestinian summer. Count the human cost of that one afternoon in Amnon's chamber. Amnon dead, Absalom dead, Tamar destroyed, living in perpetual mourning. 20,000 Israelite soldiers dead in the civil war. The royal succession system shattered. David, aging prematurely, weeping in Mahanaim, the sharpest words attributed to a father in the entire Bible. "O my son Absalom, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee." All of it came from one decision. All of it came from one closed door. All of it came from a silence that built for years before it detonated. Examine the archaeological context that confirms the structure of the crime. Yigal Shiloh's excavations in the city of David, conducted between 1978 and 1985, revealed foundations of administrative and residential structures from the period of the United Monarchy. Buildings with divided interior rooms, separate corridors, royal quarters for the king's children with restricted access points. The architectural layout did not permit casual visits between quarters. Each prince or princess had an entrance controlled by their own guards and attendants. It was precisely the kind of floor plan that made Jonadab's stratagem necessary. Without a formal royal order, Tamar would never have passed through the door of Amnon's quarters. The laviva, the heart-shaped cakes, have archaeological parallels. Ceramic molds, circular and heart-shaped, have been found at Levantine sites dating to the 10th century BC. They were ceremonial and medicinal foods. The precision of the culinary detail in the biblical account reveals that the original writer was intimately familiar with the customs of the palace. The Kethoneth Pasim also has archaeological confirmation. Reliefs from the period depict royal daughters in long, multicolored tunics with sleeves reaching to the wrists, distinct from common women's garments, which had short sleeves. It was a dynastic uniform. Tamar wore that garment precisely because she was a virgin princess. Tearing it was a public declaration that the identity she had carried since birth had been destroyed forever. It was a public attestation of the end of a status she had held from the moment she was born. Historians recognize the episode of Tamar as the beginning of the fulfillment of a very specific prophecy. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 10 through 12. The prophet Nathan, when confronting David over the matter of Bathsheba and the indirect murder of Uriah, had announced 3 concrete things. The sword would never depart from the house of David. Evil would rise out of the king's own family. The king's wives would be violated in public, in broad daylight. Each of these 3 sentences found its fulfillment in the sequence that began with the rape of Tamar. The sword started there. The evil emerged from within the house from the firstborn son himself. And later, during Absalom's revolt, he took his father's concubines in a tent pitched on the roof of the palace in sight of all Israel, precisely as Nathan's words had described, spoken years before. The biblical text presents a complete causal chain. David's private sin with Bathsheba germinated in Amnon's private sin against Tamar, which germinated in Absalom's vengeance against Amnon, which germinated in Absalom's rebellion against David, which germinated in the death of 20,000 soldiers and the near ruin of the United Kingdom. And all of it began with a door that closed on an afternoon of heart-shaped cakes. Consider what Tamar carried for the rest of her life. A royal princess, trained from childhood for a strategic marriage to a neighboring noble or king. Her political value was immense. Marriages between David's daughters and regional dynasties sustained peace along the borders of the kingdom. That future was cancelled in an afternoon. As a violated woman, she lost all matrimonial value in the logic of that society. As a princess, she became a political liability. She never appears again in the biblical records after 2 Samuel chapter 13. She exits the stage of history. The silences in the Bible also tell stories. The silence about Tamar is a narrative sentence. She lived, but her public life died at Amnon's door. Historians estimate that women in comparable situations in ancient Israelite society spent the rest of their days secluded in the homes of relatives, sustained economically but socially erased. Tamar probably lived for decades more, decades in an anonymity imposed by another person's crime. Decades paying the price of a moment in which other people, Amnon, Jonadab, and even David through his failure to act, made their choices. The phrase the text preserves about her, desolate in the house of her brother Absalom, is among the sharpest lines in ancient literature. In 2 words, it summarizes an entire life reduced to permanent mourning. Silence. And there is a psychological cost in David that the texts preserve with brutal honesty. David, the man after God's own heart, failed consistently as a father. He did not discipline Amnon, he did not protect Tamar, he did not punish the rapist, he could not reconcile with Absalom in time. He wept for both dead sons. He watched the kingdom fracture. He grew old surrounded by conspiracies inside his own palace. Adonijah, another of David's sons, would attempt to seize the throne in the king's final days. Before Solomon consolidated the succession, yet another son against a father, yet more blood within the house, yet another cycle repeating inside the same family. The house of David never recovered its internal peace until the kingdom itself divided. In the generation of Rehoboam, David's grandson, the empire split in 2, Judah in the south, Israel in the north. The geographical division of the kingdom had its roots in the family fractures that began on the afternoon Tamar knocked on her brother's door to prepare heart-shaped cakes before his eyes. The Christian writers of the 1st century would recognize patterns in this narrative. Jesus of Nazareth would be born 1,000 years later, according to traditional chronologies, in the same lineage of David, in Bethlehem, the city of the same family. The New Testament presents him as son of David through the genealogy documented in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. He would enter Jerusalem riding a donkey, coming down from the Mount of Olives, the same mountain David had crossed weeping barefoot, fleeing his own rebellious son. And there is a symmetry that ancient scholars noted. David, failing to protect his daughter, let blood run within the house. His direct descendant, centuries later, would offer his own blood to cover the failures of others. The royal house that destroyed itself in 2 Samuel chapter 13 would produce, through the same lineage, someone who would offer himself as a sacrifice for human crimes. The biblical writers compose a single literary and theological architecture. The tragedy of Tamar is part of the fabric that prepares, by contrast, the later significance of the son of David, who would choose not to inflict suffering, but to bear it in the place of others. And perhaps that is the reading this oldest story sustains most powerfully. Private decisions generate public catastrophes. Silences are repaid with interest by the generations that follow. A father's failures to act resurface as civil wars. Doors closed on an autumn afternoon determined the future of entire families for centuries. Tamar never knew that her story would cross 3 millennia. Amnon died believing he had triumphed over his brother. Absalom died hanging from his hair, believing he had triumphed over his father. David died singing psalms, without having managed to protect any of the children who needed him most. And in some forgotten corridor of the ancient palace, a door remained closed forever in the memory of the sacred records. The whole story began there, and it has not yet finished collecting its debt.